Welcome to Dreamy History. Here's what makes no sense about the Viking Age and why it's so utterly compelling. Everyone pictures these horned-helmeted berserkers, mindless in their fury, smashing and grabbing across Europe. And yes, the smashing and grabbing part certainly happened, often with terrifying efficiency. But here's the paradox. This era, which we define by sudden violent raids, was actually born from a deeply sophisticated, technologically advanced, and globally connected society. The very people who struck such terror into the hearts of monks and kings were also master shipwrights, canny traders, skilled artisans, and farmers deeply attuned to the rhythms of their land. They built beautiful ships without blueprints, navigated vast, open oceans without compasses, and established trade routes stretching from the Arctic to the Caliphate of Baghdad. The iconic image of the brutal barbarian only tells half the story, and arguably, it's the less interesting half. What truly fascinates is understanding how a collection of scattered farming communities in the north could transform, almost overnight, into the dominant force shaping the political, economic and cultural landscape of Europe for over 2 centuries. It's a story of innovation, adaptation, and an almost unbelievable surge of human ambition. If you're enjoying this journey through history, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And I'm always curious. Drop a comment letting me know what city and time zone you're watching from. There's something special about knowing this story is reaching people all over the world. Let's start with the question nobody asks. What were these quote 0 doing before they became quote 1? Because the term itself, quote 2, primarily refers to the activity, the raiding or journeying overseas, rather than a distinct ethnicity. Before the infamous attack on Lindisfarne in 793 CE, the people of what we now call Scandinavia, modern-day Norway, Sweden and Denmark, were not some isolated, forgotten backwater. Far from it. They were a dynamic, if decentralized, collection of agricultural communities, fiercely independent, but also keenly aware of the wider world through centuries of established trade. Imagine the landscape of Scandinavia in the late 8th century. Long, narrow fjords carving deep into mountainous coastlines, vast, dense forests, and patches of arable land often hard-won from the unforgiving terrain. Life was largely agrarian, centered around extended families living in longhouses, massive timber structures, perhaps 60 to 80 feet long, with a central hearth for warmth and cooking, housing people and livestock under a single turf-covered roof. These were self-sufficient communities, raising cattle, sheep and pigs, cultivating barley, rye and oats, and supplementing their diet with abundant fish, wild game and foraged berries. The rhythm of life was dictated by the seasons, by the planting and harvesting, the fishing and hunting, the long dark winters and the brief intensely productive summers. While self-sufficiency was key, these communities were never truly isolated. For centuries they had been trading. Furs from the vast northern forests, amber washed up on the Baltic shores, iron smelted from bog ore, and specialized goods like soapstone and whetstones were exchanged for silver, fine cloth, and even luxury items from the Roman Empire and later the burgeoning Frankish kingdoms. This wasn't some grand, organized mercantile empire, but rather a network of local chieftains and enterprising individuals sailing small open boats along the coasts and rivers, bartering at seasonal markets. These early ships, while not the sleek dragon-prowed vessels of later fame, were robust, clinker-built wooden boats, meaning their planks overlapped like roof tiles, perfectly suited for coastal navigation and carrying a modest cargo. This mastery of the sea, born of necessity in a region where water was often the easiest highway, was a foundational skill honed over generations. The social structure was hierarchical but fluid. At the top were the jarls or chieftains, powerful landowners and warriors whose authority was based on wealth, lineage, and their ability to command loyalty and provide protection. Below them were the carla, the freemen, who owned land, bore arms, and had a voice in the thing. The local assembly where laws were made, disputes settled, and leaders chosen. At the bottom were the thralls, or slaves, often captured in skirmishes or born into servitude. Honour, reputation, and the ability to defend one's family and land were paramount. Their worldview, still pagan, was steeped in a rich tapestry of gods and myths. Odin, the All-Father, god of wisdom and war. Thor, the mighty protector of mankind. Freya, goddess of love and fertility. Valhalla, the Hall of Slain Warriors, was a powerful concept, promising a glorious afterlife for those who died bravely in battle. This wasn't a religion of quiet contemplation, but one deeply intertwined with action, fate, and the pursuit of glory. By the late 8th century, several factors were converging that would soon push these seafaring farmers beyond their familiar shores. Population growth, particularly in areas with limited arable land, meant increasing pressure on resources. Improvements in shipbuilding technology, building upon centuries of inherited knowledge, were yielding faster, more seaworthy vessels capable of longer voyages and carrying more men. The Clara, a sturdier cargo ship, was evolving alongside the Langskip, the longship, designed for speed and carrying warriors. These longships, with their shallow draft, allowed them to navigate not just open seas, but also rivers, piercing deep into the heart of foreign lands. Crucially, the political landscape of Europe was changing. The Frankish Empire under Charlemagne was expanding, pushing its borders and its Christian faith aggressively, often bringing it into conflict with pagan peoples, including the Saxons to the south of Denmark. This expansion created both a barrier and an opportunity. It created rich, settled targets, monasteries, towns and royal estates, which ironically were often poorly defended, their wealth concentrated and tempting. The Frankish kings and their Anglo-Saxon counterparts in England had established stable, prosperous kingdoms, but they were largely land-focused, with little thought given to coastal defence against a threat that simply hadn't existed on this scale before. It was into this world of burgeoning Norse ambition, advanced maritime skill, and tempting, vulnerable targets that the first great recorded blow of the Viking Age would fall. The stage was set, the ships were ready, and the eyes of the north were beginning to turn outwards, towards the soft, rich lands to the south and west. And we're only getting started on understanding how these forces would collide and reshape the continent, but that's a story for the next chapter, as we consider the impact of that fateful day on the holy island of Lindisfarne. And so the stage was meticulously set. We've explored the fertile ground of Scandinavia, the ingenuity of its people, the ambitions simmering beneath the surface, and the ripe, unsuspecting targets across the North Sea. All the elements were in place for a collision of worlds, a moment that would etch itself into the annals of history and forever alter the course of Europe. Welcome back to Dreamy History, where we unravel the true saga of the Viking Age. If you're enjoying this journey, do make sure you're subscribed, because we're about to witness the spark that ignited a revolution. The year is 793 CE. The place, Lindisfarne, a small tidal island off the northeast coast of Anglo-Saxon Northumbria. This was no ordinary island. It was, for the Christian world, a beacon. A revered monastic settlement founded by St. Aidan in 635 CE, Lindisfarne was the spiritual heart of Northumbria, a repository of holy relics, illuminated manuscripts like the magnificent Lindisfarne Gospels, and considerable wealth accumulated through generations of pious donations. It was a place of peace, prayer, and scholarship, utterly unprepared for what was about to descend upon its shores. Imagine the scene. A quiet June morning, perhaps a gentle sea mist still clinging to the ancient stone walls. The monks, dedicated to their routines of prayer and contemplation, would have been going about their day. They had no standing army, no defences against external threats beyond the spiritual. Their wealth was not guarded by battlements, but by faith, their treasures openly displayed within the church, offerings to God. They knew of no enemies from the sea. Coastal raids were not a concern in their world. Then, from the vast open expanse of the North Sea, they came. Not a fleet of warships in the traditional sense, but the sleek, graceful lang skips we discussed, their single square sails catching the wind, their dragon-headed prows cutting through the waves. These vessels, so revolutionary in their design, allowed the Norse warriors to approach undetected, to land swiftly on the shallow beaches, and to strike with terrifying speed. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, one of our most vital contemporary sources, records the horror with chilling brevity. Quote 3:4. That phrase, right there, encapsulates the absolute terror and incomprehension that gripped Christian Europe. These weren't just invaders. They were perceived as agents of divine wrath, unholy and utterly alien. They desecrated sacred altars, smashed holy images, trampled relics, and slaughtered monks. They seized the gold and silver vessels, the ornate crosses, the jewelled bindings of the Gospels. They dragged away the young men and women, not for ransom, but for the burgeoning slave markets of the North. This was not simply a raid for loot. This was an assault on the very fabric of Christian civilization. The sacrilege was profound, sending shock waves across the continent. Alcuin of York, a prominent scholar and advisor to Charlemagne, wrote anguished letters describing the event. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar, and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God like dung in the street. His words paint a vivid picture of utter devastation and moral outrage. But here's the paradox, the crucial point we need to grasp. While the Christian world saw mindless, bloodthirsty barbarians, the Norse raiders saw opportunity, wealth, and the chance for glory. For them, these undefended monasteries were not sacred ground, but simply rich targets. Their pagan worldview held no reverence for Christian symbols. In fact, destroying them might even be seen as a challenge to foreign gods, a testament to the strength of their own pantheon. Gold was gold, silver was silver, and slaves were a valuable commodity, regardless of their previous owner or faith. The attack on Lindisfarne was a masterclass in calculated efficiency. It demonstrated the unparalleled capabilities of Norse shipbuilding and navigation. Imagine, if you will, navigating open seas in relatively small vessels, hitting a precise, relatively isolated target, overwhelming it with speed and ferocity, and then vanishing back into the waves before any organized resistance could be mounted. This wasn't random violence. It was strategic. The langskip was not just a means of transport. It was a weapon system, enabling surprise and retreat, making the raiders virtually uncatchable by land-based forces. What drove them to this specific act, at this specific time? It wasn't just the allure of easy wealth, though that was certainly a powerful motivator. Remember the pressures we discussed in the last chapter? This strain of a growing population on limited arable land in Scandinavia, the spirit of enterprise, and the inherent ambition of a society that valued action, honour, and reputation above all else. A successful raid brought immense prestige to the Jarl or chieftain who led it, wealth to his followers, and a chance for the warriors to prove their prowess and earn a place in Valhalla. Lindisfarne was not an anomaly. It was a harbinger. While it stands as the most famously recorded start of the Viking Age, we know from archaeological evidence and later chronicles that smaller, unrecorded raids likely occurred before it. But Lindisfarne was different. It was a highly visible, deeply symbolic target, and its destruction sent an unmistakable message across Europe. A new, terrifying force had emerged from the northern seas. In the years immediately following Lindisfarne, the pattern intensified. Just 2 years later, in 795 CE, the monastery at Jarrow, another significant Northumbrian monastic centre, was attacked. The same year saw raids on the west coast of Ireland, targeting monasteries like Iona, a sister foundation to Lindisfarne. These were not isolated incidents but part of a growing wave. The Norse were learning, adapting, and expanding their reach. They discovered that the coastal regions of Christian Europe, particularly the wealthy, undefended monasteries, were ripe for the taking. The initial raids were typically hit-and-run operations, land, plunder, retreat. But as the Norse grew bolder and more familiar with the geography and vulnerabilities of their targets, these expeditions began to evolve. They started to winter over in conquered territories, establishing temporary bases. They began to demand tribute, the infamous Danegeld, a protection payment to spare towns and regions from further ravaging. This wasn't just about snatching loot. It was about asserting power and control, leveraging their military advantage for sustained economic gain. This evolution from opportunistic raiding to strategic extortion, and eventually to conquest and settlement, is one of the most compelling narratives of the Viking Age. It challenges the simplistic image of Quote 7 and reveals a people who were incredibly adaptable, pragmatic, and politically astute. They were not just destroyers, they were keenly aware of value, resources, and power dynamics. The same ships that carried raiders also carried traders, exploring new routes, establishing new markets, and connecting distant lands. The same navigational skills used for a surprise attack could guide them to new lands for settlement, from Iceland to Greenland, and even, as we'll see, to the shores of North America. So, while Lindisfarne marked a brutal, shocking beginning, it was just that, a beginning. It opened a door, or perhaps blew it off its hinges, revealing a world of possibilities for the ambitious Norse. The fear and devastation they wrought were undeniable, But beneath the surface of the quote eight lay a complex dynamic society poised to embark on an unbelievable surge of human ambition, exploration and transformation. The Viking Age, in all its multifaceted glory and grim reality, had truly begun, and we're only getting started on this incredible journey of discovery. Next, we'll delve into how these initial raids blossomed into vast networks of trade, conquest, and the forging of new kingdoms across Europe and beyond. Welcome back to Dreamy History. If you're enjoying this incredible journey through the Viking Age, I hope you're ready to dive even deeper, because we're only just beginning to scratch the surface of this utterly compelling era. Last time, we witnessed the infamous attack on Lindisfarne in 793 CE, a moment that for many marks the true beginning of the Viking Age. But here's the paradox. While it certainly sent shockwaves across Christian Europe, for the Norse, it wasn't a sudden, unprovoked explosion of violence. Far from it. It was a calculated, opportunistic, and ultimately logical extension of their existing maritime culture, their ambition, and their pagan worldview. The monastic chroniclers, reeling from the sacrilege and bloodshed, painted a picture of mindless demonic barbarians. But as we discussed, what they encountered was a masterclass in efficiency, a force that understood the vulnerabilities of settled, wealthy societies and possessed the technological prowess, those incredible langskips, to exploit them. Lindisfarne wasn't an isolated incident. It was merely the opening salvo. Imagine, if you will, the ripple effect. News of the raid spread like wildfire, carried by terrified survivors and the increasingly frantic dispatches of kings and bishops. But the Norse didn't wait for the dust to settle. They were already moving. The Northumbrian coast, then the shores of Ireland, the coasts of Francia, and later the estuaries of Anglo-Saxon England, all felt the bite of the serpent-prowed longships. The pattern was quickly established. Swift, brutal raids on isolated wealthy targets, monasteries, undefended towns, royal estates. They struck, plundered, enslaved, and vanished back into the mist and sea, leaving behind a trail of smoke, despair, and a profound sense of helplessness. This initial phase, roughly spanning the late 8th and early 9th centuries, was characterized by these hit-and-run tactics. The goal was plunder: silver, gold, precious artifacts, textiles, and, critically, thralls, human beings to be sold into slavery. For the jarls and carlers leading these expeditions, it was a direct route to wealth, prestige, and power. Back home in Scandinavia, the spoils of a successful raid would elevate a chieftain's standing, allow him to reward his followers, and attract more warriors to his banner. It was a self-perpetuating cycle of ambition and opportunity. But the Norse were nothing if not adaptable. They quickly realized that simply plundering was one thing. Controlling territory and extracting long-term wealth was another entirely. And this, my friends, is where the narrative truly begins to shift, challenging that simplistic, barbarian image even further. They weren't just raiders. They were astute strategists, recognizing that sustained pressure could yield far greater returns. Enter the Danegeld. This concept, which truly fascinates me, represents a significant evolution in Viking strategy. Instead of merely taking what they could carry, the Norse began to demand tribute, a payment usually in silver, to not raid a particular area. Imagine the sheer audacity. Quote Jan, for the beleaguered kings of Europe, facing a mobile, unpredictable enemy they couldn't easily pin down. Paying the Steingeld often seemed like the lesser of two evils. It was a protection racket on an international scale, and it proved incredibly effective, funneling vast amounts of wealth back to Scandinavia and into the hands of ambitious Norse leaders. And to facilitate this sustained pressure, the Norse began to establish something new: winter camps. No longer content to simply sail home after a summer of raiding, they started to dig in, fortifying positions, often on islands or at river mouths. These winter camps, or long forts as they were known in Ireland, were game changers. They allowed the Norse to maintain a presence year-round, to consolidate their gains, and to launch deeper, more extensive campaigns inland. From these bases, they could repair ships, gather intelligence, trade with locals, yes, even while raiding, and plan their next moves with precision. This wasn't the work of disorganized savages. It was the strategic planning of a sophisticated military force. Think about the implications. A winter camp meant a continuous threat. It meant local populations lived in perpetual fear. It meant that the Norse were no longer just a transient menace, but a semi-permanent fixture, beginning to exert real political and economic influence. We see this particularly in Ireland, where Viking strongholds like Dublin, Wexford and Waterford would eventually grow into major urban centres, founded by the very people who had once merely raided the coasts. But what drove this unbelievable surge of human ambition and mobility? It wasn't solely about the thrill of battle or the lure of plunder. Back in Scandinavia, internal pressures continued to mount. Population growth, while not explosive, meant increased competition for finite arable land in a landscape dominated by forests, mountains, and fjords. The traditional inheritance system, where land might be divided among sons, could lead to smaller, less viable holdings over generations. For younger sons, for those without significant land holdings, or for ambitious Karlas eager to make a name for themselves, going Viking offered a clear path to wealth, land, and status. It was a chance to escape the strictures of local society, to prove oneself in battle, and to return a rich man, perhaps even a jarl in his own right, able to command respect and loyalty. The pagan worldview, with its emphasis on honour, glory in battle, and the promise of Valhalla for fallen warriors, provided a powerful spiritual framework for these dangerous expeditions. Life was hard, and death was often swift. Better to die with a sword in hand seeking glory than to wither away on a meagre farm. And here's where we challenge another common misconception. The Viking was not just a warrior. While the warrior aspect is undeniable and sensational, it was always intertwined with other roles. The same longships that carried warriors to raid also carried traders. The same men who plundered monasteries also established complex trade networks, stretching from the Arctic Circle to the Caliphate of Baghdad. They were merchants, explorers, and settlers. Consider the Kaupangar, the early trading towns like Hedeby in Denmark or Birka in Sweden. These were bustling hubs of commerce, where goods from all corners of the known world changed hands. Furs from the north, amber from the Baltic, slaves from the captured lands, silver from the Frankish Empire, and exotic silks and spices from the Islamic world, brought via the eastern river routes. The Norse were not just taking, they were also exchanging, facilitating a vast web of economic interaction that predated the Viking Age proper and intensified dramatically during it. They were integral players in the global economy of the early medieval period. As the 9th century progressed, the scale of Viking operations grew. We start to see larger, more organised forces, often referred to as great armies, or the Great Heathen Army. These were not simply bands of raiders, they were formidable military expeditions, sometimes numbering thousands of warriors, complete with cavalry, acquired through raiding or trade, logistical support, and a clear strategic objective: conquest and settlement. They began to challenge the very foundations of the kingdoms they encountered. The European response initially was a mix of terror and disorganization. The Frankish Empire, under Charlemagne and his successors, had focused its military might on land-based threats from the east. Its vast coastlines and navigable rivers, once avenues of trade, became highways for Viking incursions. Charlemagne himself, though a formidable emperor, struggled to establish effective coastal defences. His successors, embroiled in internal conflicts, were even less equipped to handle the relentless Norse pressure. Fortifications were built, local militias were raised, but the sheer mobility and unpredictability of the longships often overwhelmed these defences. In England, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms found themselves increasingly under siege. The small, independent kingdoms of Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia and Wessex were constantly battling each other, making a unified defence almost impossible. This disunity, coupled with the wealth accumulated in their monasteries and the fertile lands ripe for settlement, presented an irresistible target for the Norse. So as we move through the early 9th century, we see the Viking Age deepening and broadening. It's no longer just about the shock of Lindisfarne. It's about the establishment of permanent footholds, the systematic extraction of wealth through tribute, and the burgeoning of vast trade networks. It's about a people who, driven by a complex mix of economic necessity, political ambition, technological superiority, and a powerful cultural ethos, were fundamentally reshaping the map of Europe. They were not just a destructive force, they were a transformative one. They built new towns, stimulated trade, introduced new technologies, and yes, instilled fear. But to truly understand them, we must see them as multifaceted agents of change, not one-dimensional barbarians. Their impact was felt from the shores of North America, a story for a much later chapter, all the way to the heart of the Byzantine Empire, and the story of how they achieved this, how they built kingdoms and empires, and how they ultimately left an indelible mark on global history is what we'll explore next. The stage is set, the longships are launched, and the world is about to change forever. Welcome back to Dreamy History. If you're enjoying this journey through the Viking Age as much as I am, then you know we've just scratched the surface of how truly transformative this era was. We've seen the initial shock of Lindisfarne, the evolution from hit-and-run raids to the strategic Danegeld and winter camps, and the emergence of what European chroniclers, with a mix of terror and awe, began to call the Great Armies. But here's where the narrative truly gets complex and utterly fascinating. These, quote 16, weren't just larger bands of raiders, far from it. Imagine, if you will, not just a war band, but a veritable migration on the move. We're talking about thousands of Norse warriors, certainly, but also their families, their artisans, their thralls, and all the accoutrements of a society on the march. These were not centrally commanded forces in the way a modern army might be. Rather, they were often coalitions of ambitious jarls and powerful chieftains, each leading their own retinues, bound together by shared goals of wealth, land, and glory. Their unity was often pragmatic, their leadership fluid, and their internal politics as complex as any kingdom they sought to conquer. What drove them to leave their homelands in such numbers? The same factors we discussed earlier: population pressures in Scandinavia, a taste for the riches of the south, and crucially the growing understanding that Europe was not just a place to plunder, but a place to settle. The promise of land, a commodity often scarce and hard won back home in the fjords and forests, was a powerful motivator for a young, ambitious Karl, freeman with few prospects. Joining a great army was an opportunity for social mobility, for prestige, and for carving out a new destiny. They were, in essence, early medieval entrepreneurs, investing their lives and their langskips in a high-stakes venture. The sheer logistical feat of these armies is astounding. They would sail their longships up rivers, dismantle them to portage overland, and then reassemble them to navigate further inland. They built fortifications, established supply lines, and adapted their tactics to the varied landscapes of Europe. And yes, they were still terrifyingly effective in battle, but their true genius lay in their adaptability and their long-term vision. They weren't just looking for a quick smash and grab anymore, they were looking to stay. Now, let's turn our gaze to England, a fragmented land of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms ripe for the picking. For decades following Lindisfarne, the Norse had been a persistent, gnawing presence along the coasts. But in the mid-9th century, the Great Heathen Army, as the Anglo-Saxon chronicles dubbed it, arrived with a different intent. This was a force that aimed not merely to raid, but to conquer and to hold territory. Imagine the terror, but also the grim determination, as these Norse forces systematically campaigned across Mercia, Northumbria, and East Anglia. They overran kingdoms, installed puppet rulers, and eventually began to settle the land. The culmination of this era in England is perhaps best embodied by the Danelaw. After years of relentless warfare, particularly against the Kingdom of Wessex under the formidable King Alfred the Great, a new political reality emerged. The Treaty of Wedmore in 878 CE, following Alfred's victory at Edington, didn't expel the Norse entirely. Instead, it acknowledged their presence and carved out a substantial portion of eastern England, from the River Thames northwards to the River Tees, as territory under Norse control. This was the Danelaw, a region where Norse law, Norse customs, and Norse chieftains held sway. Think about that for a moment. This wasn't just a peace treaty. It was the formal recognition of a new, hybrid society. In the Danelaw, Norse settlers established farms, built towns, and integrated into the existing Anglo-Saxon communities, albeit as the dominant force. The impact was profound and long-lasting. You can still see it today in English place names. Towns ending in, quote, 17 farm, village, quote, 18 hamlet, quote, 19 church, are often indicators of Norse settlement, and our very language is peppered with Norse loanwords, quote 20, quote 21, quote 22, quote 23, quote 24, quote 25, quote 26, quote 27, quote 28, quote 29, and even quote 30, quote 31, and quote 32. The English language, like English culture itself, became a fascinating tapestry, woven with Anglo-Saxon and Norse threads. This was not simply a story of conquest, but of cultural infusion, of legal systems clashing and merging, and of a new identity slowly being forged. Meanwhile, across the Irish Sea, the Norse presence in Ireland was also evolving dramatically. We already touched upon Dublin, founded as a long fort and rapidly growing into a bustling trading port. But it wasn't alone. Norse settlements sprang up along the coast, becoming the nuclei of other important towns like Wexford, Waterford, Cork, and Limerick. These were not just military outposts, they were vibrant urban centres, connecting Ireland into the broader Norse trade network that stretched from the Baltic to Baghdad. The native Irish kingdoms, much like their Anglo-Saxon counterparts, were initially fragmented and struggled to present a united front. The Norse became a persistent force in Irish politics, sometimes raiding, sometimes trading, sometimes forming alliances with Irish kings against their rivals, and often intermarrying into local dynasties. The result was a rich and complex Hiberno-Norse culture, where Norse sagas mingled with Irish myths, and the distinctive art styles of both peoples blended beautifully. Imagine the bustling markets of Dublin, where Irish chieftains in their kilts might haggle with Norse merchants over silver arm rings and exotic silks, all against a backdrop of longhouses and round towers. It was a dynamic, often violent, but undeniably creative period. But perhaps one of the most striking transformations occurred in what would become known as Normandy. For decades, the Frankish Empire, even after the unifying reign of Charlemagne, found itself under relentless pressure from Norse raids. The mighty rivers of Francia, the Seine, the Loire, the Garonne, became highways for the longships, carrying warriors deep into the heart of the empire. Paris itself was besieged multiple times. The Frankish kings, weakened by internal divisions, often resorted to paying Danegeld to make the Norse raiders go away, a strategy that often proved to be a temporary and expensive reprieve. It was into this volatile landscape that a formidable Norse chieftain named Rollo emerged. After years of campaigning and establishing a strong presence along the lower Seine, Rollo entered into negotiations with the Frankish king Charles the Simple. The result, in 911 CE, was the Treaty of St. Clair-sur-Epte. In exchange for peace, recognition of his territory, and a pledge to defend the Frankish realm from other Norse raiders, Rollo converted to Christianity and became the first Duke of Normandy. This was a truly pivotal moment. Imagine the sheer audacity. A Norse warrior who had likely sacked countless Christian churches was now granted legitimate rule over a significant portion of Frankish territory, provided he swore fealty to a Christian king and adopted the new faith. And he did. Rollo and his descendants, the Dukes of Normandy, rapidly adopted Frankish language, law, and customs. Within a few generations, these Northmen, Norsemen, had become Normans, a distinct cultural group that would in turn go on to conquer England in 1066 CE and influence much of medieval Europe. The transformation from pagan raider to Christian duke, from foreign invader to integrated ruler, is one of the most compelling stories of cultural assimilation in history. So, as you can see, the Norse impact was far more than just a series of violent incursions. It was a profound reshaping of the political, social, and cultural map of Europe. From the Danelaw to the Hiberno-Norse kingdoms of Ireland and the powerful Duchy of Normandy, The Norse were not just destroying. They were building, settling, and creating new societies that bore their indelible mark. And while these dramatic conquests were unfolding, the spirit of enterprise that had always characterized the Norse continued unabated. The trade networks they had established only grew stronger and more extensive, now connected by their new settlements and kingdoms. Goods and ideas flowed across the continent, from the furs of the Arctic to the silver of the Caliphate, all facilitated by these intrepid voyagers. And for some, the lure of the unknown still beckoned, pushing them not just to settle conquered lands, but to explore entirely new ones. That, my friends, is a story for our next chapter, a tale of discovery and daring that would take the Norse far beyond the shores of Europe itself. Welcome back to Dreamy History, where we're peeling back the layers of the Viking Age, revealing a story far richer and more complex than the popular imagination often allows. In our last chapter, we saw how the Norse, initially perceived as mere raiders, became architects of new societies, from the Danelaw to the Duchy of Normandy, culminating in the Norman conquest of England in 1066. An incredible journey, isn't it? But here's the thing. While these dramatic events were unfolding in Western Europe, profoundly reshaping its future, another equally significant, though often less understood saga was playing out to the east. If you thought the Vikings were confined to the North Atlantic and Western European coastlines, think again. Their ambition, their ingenuity, and their sheer drive for enterprise stretched far beyond what we've discussed so far. We're talking about a vast interconnected network that reached from the Baltic Sea all the way to the heart of the Byzantine Empire and the glittering caliphates of the Islamic world. This, my friends, is the story of the Rus, the Eastern Vikings, the Varangians, and their pivotal role in the formation of what would become Russia and Ukraine. Imagine, if you will, the dense, ancient forests of Eastern Europe, the late 8th and 9th centuries. Picture winding, slow-moving rivers snaking through vast plains, connecting lakes and estuaries. This was a world teeming with different Slavic and Finnic tribes, largely decentralized, engaged in local agriculture and trade. And into this world came the Norse, primarily those from what is now Sweden. While their Danish and Norwegian cousins were busy raiding monasteries and settling in England, Ireland and France, these Eastern Vikings had a different, though equally ambitious agenda: trade. Now don't get me wrong, they certainly weren't above a bit of raiding and tribute extraction when the opportunity arose, far from it. But their primary motivation, the engine driving their expansion into this enormous uncharted territory, was the pursuit of wealth through commerce. They were seeking out lucrative trade routes to acquire highly prized goods: furs from the northern forests, amber from the Baltic, and, perhaps most crucially, access to the silver dirhams of the Abbasid Caliphate, and the silks, spices, and gold of Constantinople, the jewel of the Byzantine Empire. These Eastern Norse, whom the locals came to call the Rus, a term whose etymology is still debated but most likely refers to the rowers, or men from Sweden, were master navigators of a different kind. Instead of the open ocean, their domain was the intricate network of rivers. They would load their longships, often modified for shallower waters, with their own goods, ironware, weapons, tools, and embark on incredible journeys down the major river systems, the Volga, the Dnieper, the Dvina, and the Neva. Think about the sheer logistical challenge of this. These weren't easy cruises. The rivers were often interrupted by treacherous rapids, requiring the heavy boats to be portaged, dragged overland on rollers and logs for miles at a time. Imagine the back-breaking labour, the coordination, the sheer grit required to move a fully laden longship, sometimes with its crew and cargo, across land. This wasn't just about sailing, it was about an indomitable will to overcome every natural obstacle in their path to reach those distant markets. As they pushed deeper, they established fortified trading posts, which quickly grew into bustling settlements. Cities like Novgorod, the new city, became vital hubs, connecting the Baltic trade with the southern routes. Further south, Kyiv, strategically located on the Dnieper, emerged as another powerful centre. These were not just places for trade, they were nuclei of power. The Rus chieftains, or knyazes, began to assert control over the surrounding Slavic tribes, often through a combination of protection, tribute collection, and military might. It was a complex relationship, sometimes exploitative, sometimes symbiotic, but always transformative. The Rus, much like their Western counterparts, weren't just warriors. They were entrepreneurs, administrators, and ultimately state builders. They provided a nascent form of political organisation and a crucial economic link to the wider world. Their influence was so profound that eventually the land itself became known as the, quote, 40, giving rise to the name, quote, 41. It's truly fascinating to consider how a group of intrepid Norse traders, driven by the same Viking spirit of ambition and exploration, laid the very foundations of one of the world's largest nations. But their journey didn't end with the Slavic tribes. The ultimate prize lay further south, the two great imperial powers of the age. To the southeast, the Abbasid Caliphate, with its capital in Baghdad, was a beacon of wealth and learning. The Rus traded furs, honey, wax, and tragically slaves, often captured Slavic peoples, for vast quantities of silver dirhams. Archaeological finds across Scandinavia and Eastern Europe bear testament to this trade, with hoards of Islamic silver coins providing tangible proof of this incredible economic connection. This wasn't just a local market. This was global commerce, Viking style, linking the Arctic Circle to the Middle East. And then there was Byzantium. Constantinople, quote, 42, quote, was the largest, wealthiest, and most sophisticated city in Europe. For the Rus, it represented both an irresistible target for plunder and an unparalleled opportunity for trade. Their relationship with the Byzantines was, shall we say, complicated. There were numerous Rus attacks on Constantinople, terrifying assaults by fleets of longships down the Dnieper and across the Black Sea, threatening the very walls of the imperial capital. The Byzantines, for their part, learned to respect the ferocity of these northern warriors. But here's the paradox, a recurring theme in our exploration of the Viking Age. These formidable warriors, who once threatened Constantinople, eventually became its most loyal protectors. Many Rus, drawn by the promise of wealth and prestige, entered the service of the Byzantine emperor, forming the elite Varangian Guard. Imagine these imposing Norsemen, clad in chainmail, wielding their massive two-handed axes, standing sentinel over the emperor, renowned for their unwavering loyalty and fearsome combat skills. They were foreigners, yes, but their prowess was so valued that they became an integral part of the imperial household, a testament to the Vikings' adaptability and the universal demand for skilled warriors. This integration wasn't just military. Through trade and diplomacy, the Rus were increasingly exposed to Byzantine culture, particularly its religion, Orthodox Christianity. For generations, the Rus, like all Norse, had adhered to their ancestral pagan beliefs, honouring Odin, Thor, and the pantheon of Norse gods. But the allure of the sophisticated monotheistic religion of the Byzantines, with its powerful rituals, magnificent churches, and promise of a unified state, was immense. The pivotal moment came in the late 10th century with Prince Vladimir the Great of Kiev. Legend has it that Vladimir, seeking a unifying religion for his disparate realm, sent envoys to observe the practices of various faiths: Islam, Judaism, Roman Catholicism, and Orthodox Christianity. His envoys to Constantinople were reportedly so overwhelmed by the beauty and grandeur of the Hagia Sophia and the Byzantine liturgy that they declared, in 988 CE, Vladimir made the momentous decision to convert to Orthodox Christianity, and subsequently ordered the mass baptism of his people in the Dnieper River. This wasn't merely a religious conversion. It was a profound political and cultural transformation. It linked Kievan Ruses irrevocably to the Byzantine cultural sphere, bringing with it a new alphabet, Cyrillic, developed by Byzantine missionaries, new legal codes, and a new artistic and architectural tradition. It signalled the end of the pagan era for the Rus, and marked their firm integration into the wider Christian world. What an incredible trajectory! From ambitious traders paddling up treacherous rivers, to establishing powerful city-states, to serving as elite imperial guards, and finally to founding a Christian nation that would become a dominant force in Eastern Europe. The story of the Rus is yet another powerful example of the multifaceted nature of the Vikings. They weren't just destroyers, they were pioneers, builders, and cultural conduits, connecting disparate worlds and forging new identities. Their legacy in the East is as profound as that of their kin in the West. The very name, quote, 44, quote, echoes their presence, and the historical and cultural ties between Scandinavia and Eastern Europe, though less publicised than the Western European connections, are deep and enduring. As we move forward, we'll continue to see how this unbelievable surge of human ambition, exploration, and adaptation played out across the globe. Because while the Rus were consolidating their power and the Normans were conquering England, the Norse spirit of adventure was still pushing boundaries, reaching even further. And that, my friends, is a story for our next chapter, a journey that takes us to the very edge of the known world and beyond. Stay with us, because the Viking Age still has so many incredible secrets to reveal. Welcome back to Dreamy History, fellow time travellers. If you've been following along, we've journeyed from the misty fjords of Scandinavia, through the fiery raids on Lindisfarne, across the battlefields of Anglo-Saxon England, and deep into the intricate trade networks of Eastern Europe, all the way to the gilded halls of Byzantium. We've seen the Norse transform from opportunistic raiders into settlers, city builders, and the foundational elements of new European kingdoms. But here's the thing about ambition, especially Norse ambition. It rarely knows boundaries. Just when you think you've mapped the full extent of their incredible reach, they surprise you. Because while some Norsemen were busy forging empires in the east and west, others were looking in a completely different direction. towards the vast, unknown expanse of the North Atlantic. This wasn't about raiding monasteries or extorting kings. This was about something far more fundamental. This was about land. It was about freedom. And it was about an unbelievable surge of human courage that propelled them into the open ocean, chasing the setting sun and the promise of a new beginning. Imagine, if you will, the late 9th century. Scandinavia is changing. The patchwork of independent chieftains and jarls, which had been the bedrock of Norse society, is starting to consolidate. In Norway in particular, a powerful figure is rising, Harald Fairhair, who through a series of bloody battles and political manoeuvres is unifying the disparate kingdoms into a single realm. Now, for many, this was a good thing. Stability, a stronger central authority. But for others, especially those fiercely independent jarls and freemen, Karla, who valued their autonomy above all else, Harald's expanding power represented an unacceptable loss of freedom. They were not about to bend the knee. So what do you do when your homeland, once a haven of independence, begins to feel constrained? You look to the horizon, and that's precisely what some of these adventurous land-hungry Norsemen did. They heard whispers, perhaps from sailors blown off course, or from the migratory patterns of birds, of an island far to the west, a land untouched, untamed, and crucially unclaimed. This, my friends, is how the story of Iceland begins. It's often said that the discovery of Iceland was an accident, but its settlement was a deliberate act of pioneering ambition. The earliest known Norse visitor, Nadodr, was reportedly blown off course in the mid-9th century while sailing to the Faroe Islands. He returned with tales of a snowland. Later, another Swede, Gardar Svavarsson, circumnavigated it, confirming it was indeed an island, which he named Gardarsholmi, Gardar's Isle. But it was Floki Vilgedarson, around 860 CE, who famously gave it the name, quote, 47, Iceland, after a harsh winter where he saw ice floes filling a fjord. He was, let's just say, not the best publicist. But the lure of virgin land, free from kings and taxes, was too strong. The Great Landnam, or land take, began in earnest around 874 CE, led by Ingolfr Arnarsson, who is traditionally considered the first permanent Norse settler. He famously threw his high seat pillars overboard, vowing to settle wherever the gods washed them ashore. They landed in a bay he named Reykjavik, Smoky Bay, due to the steam from the geothermal hot springs. What a way to pick your capital, right? Over the next 60 years, a massive migration occurred. Thousands of Norsemen and some Celts from Ireland and Scotland, often as thralls, crossed the treacherous North Atlantic in their sturdy longships and knars. They didn't just arrive, they systematically claimed the land. This wasn't a chaotic free-for-all. It was a remarkably organised colonisation. The sagas describe how settlers would claim land by lighting fires at dawn, then walking the perimeter with a pregnant woman and carrying a flaming torch, claiming all the land that could be encircled before the woman gave birth and the torch burned out. Talk about a land grab! What makes Iceland utterly unique in this period is not just its remote location, but the society that emerged. These were not conquerors establishing a new monarchy. These were free men, many fleeing monarchical rule, who established a commonwealth. In 930 CE, they founded the Althing, a general assembly, often hailed as the world's oldest continually operating parliament. Imagine that. In a time of kings and feudal lords, These Norse pioneers created a system of laws and governance based on consensus and arbitration, where disputes were settled by elected law speakers and judges, not by a single ruler. It's an incredible testament to their capacity for self-governance and their deeply ingrained sense of justice, even if it was sometimes delivered with a sharp axe. Life in Iceland was, of course, incredibly challenging. The landscape was stark, volcanic, and the climate unforgiving. They raised sheep, cattle, and horses, fished the rich waters, and harvested what little timber grew. They had to adapt, innovate, and rely on their wits and resilience. And in this isolated crucible, a unique culture flourished, one that would later give us the magnificent Icelandic sagas, our primary window into the minds, lives, and adventures of the Norse people. But the thirst for land and adventure didn't stop at Iceland. The sagas tell us that even Iceland could become too crowded, too constrained, or simply too familiar for some. And so, the next chapter in this incredible saga of exploration takes us even further west, to a land that was given a rather deceptive name, Greenland. Our story here centres on one of the most famous or infamous figures of the Norse sagas, Erik Thorvaldsson, better known as Erik the Red. Erik was, shall we say, a man of strong opinions and an even stronger temper. Born in Norway, he was exiled to Iceland for manslaughter, mirroring the very reasons many had left Norway. And then, after settling in Iceland, he found himself exiled again for more bloodshed. This wasn't just a pattern, it was a catalyst. Around 982 CE, with a 3-year banishment hanging over his head, Erik decided to put his time to good use. He had heard rumours of land to the west, cited by a Norseman named Gunnbjörn Ulfsson decades earlier. Erik, ever the pragmatist and the visionary, decided to go find it. He sailed west and found a vast, rugged land, much of it covered in ice, but he also found fertile fjords and grassy valleys along the southwestern coast. And here's where Erik the Red really showed his marketing genius. To attract settlers to this cold, distant land, he didn't call it, quote, 50 or, quote, 51. No, he called it, quote, 52 arguing, as the saga of Erik the Red puts it, quote, 53. A brilliant move, honestly, and one that resonates with modern real estate agents. Upon his return to Iceland after his exile, Erik convinced a fleet of settlers to join him. In 986 CE, a massive convoy of 25 ships carrying men, women, children, livestock and supplies set sail. Only 14 of them made it, a stark reminder of the perils of these journeys. Those who did survive established 2 main settlements on Greenland's southwestern coast, the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement. These communities, though small, were remarkably resilient, thriving for nearly 500 years. Life in Greenland was a constant battle against the elements. The settlers relied heavily on hunting, particularly seals or walruses, for their ivory a valuable trade commodity, and polar bears. They also farmed, though the growing season was short and harsh. They built churches, established a bishopric, and maintained contact with Iceland and Norway, trading their unique Arctic resources for timber, iron, and other necessities they couldn't produce locally. They were incredibly resourceful, using every part of the animals they hunted, from blubber for fuel to bone for tools. But the Greenland settlements faced immense challenges: a gradually worsening climate, the onset of the Little Ice Age, overhunting of crucial resources, and increasing isolation as trade routes became more dangerous and less frequent. They also encountered indigenous peoples, the Inuit, whom the Norse called Skraelings, a term they also used for Native Americans, leading to both periods of trade and, tragically, conflict. By the 15th century, the Greenland settlements mysteriously vanished, leaving behind only ruins and unanswered questions, a poignant testament to the limits of human endurance, even for the indomitable Norse. Yet, before the final decline in Greenland, the spirit of exploration flared once more, pushing the boundaries of the known world to an entirely new continent. From Greenland, the next logical step was to look even further west, and this brings us to one of the most astonishing chapters in the entire history of human exploration, the Norse discovery of North America, or as they called it, Vinland. The story begins not with Erik the Red, but with his contemporary Bjarni Herjolfsson, around 986 CE, while sailing from Iceland to join Erik's new settlement in Greenland. Bjarni was blown far off course by storms and fog. When the weather cleared, he sighted land to the west, forested hills and flat beaches, unlike the icy mountains of Greenland. He chose not to land, however, preferring to stick to his original goal of reaching Greenland. He was, by all accounts, a man who knew his destination and wasn't easily sidetracked. But he returned with tales of these new lands. These tales naturally piqued the interest of the next generation of Greenlanders, especially Erik the Red's son, Leif Erikson. Leif was a true visionary, driven by a desire to explore and find resources that Greenland lacked, particularly timber. Around 1000 CE, Leif bought Bjarni's ship and set off with a crew of 35 men, retracing Bjarni's route but with a clear intention to land and explore. Their journey was methodical, almost scientific for its time. They first encountered a barren rocky land with glaciers which Leif named Flat Stone Land, likely Baffin Island. Next, they came to a flat, forested land with white sandy beaches, which he named, quote, 55, quote, forest land, probably Labrador. And finally they sailed south, discovering a land so rich that it captured their imagination, a place with abundant timber, salmon-filled rivers, and, most famously, wild grapes. Leif named this land, quote, 56, end quote, Wineland. They established a temporary settlement, building large houses and exploring the surrounding area. This was not just a fleeting visit, it was an attempt at colonization. Leif's brother, Thorvald Eriksson, led a later expedition and was killed in a skirmish with the indigenous people, whom the Norse again called Skraelings. This was the first recorded conflict between Europeans and Native Americans. The most ambitious attempt at settlement was led by Thorfinn Karlsefni, a wealthy Icelandic merchant around 1010 CE. He brought with him over 160 people, including women and children, and livestock, intending to establish a permanent colony. They settled in Vinland, traded with the Skraelings for furs, exchanging red cloth, and even had a child born there, Snorri Thorfinnsson, considered the first European born in North America. However, the interactions with the indigenous people proved to be the undoing of the Vinland venture. Initial trade quickly escalated into conflict, fueled by misunderstandings, cultural clashes, and the Norse desire to dominate. The Skraelings, numerous and well adapted to their land, eventually drove the Norse settlers away. After about 3 years, Karlsefni and his people abandoned Vinland, returning to Greenland and Iceland, their ambitious dream of a new home thwarted. For centuries, the Vinland sagas were considered fascinating but possibly exaggerated tales. That all changed in the 1960s with the incredible archaeological discovery at Lonceau Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada. Here, archaeologists unearthed undeniable proof of a Norse settlement. The remains of turf houses, a smithy, and artifacts like a bronze pin and a spindle whorl, clearly indicating a presence of women. It was a staggering validation of the sagas, confirming that the Norse had indeed reached North America, nearly 500 years before Columbus. So when we talk about the Viking Age, we're not just talking about raids on England or trade with Baghdad. We're talking about an unparalleled era of human exploration that stretched from the steppes of Russia to the shores of North America. The Norse were not just warriors, they were pioneers, colonizers, and navigators of astonishing skill and courage. They were driven by a complex mix of desperation for land, a thirst for adventure, economic opportunity, and an unyielding spirit of independence. From the barren beauty of Iceland to the icy fjords of Greenland and the tantalizing forests of Vinland, these westward voyages underscore the incredible adaptability and ambition of a people who truly reshaped the known world. They left their mark not just in sagas and archaeological sites, but in the very fabric of the lands they touched. But, as with all great eras, the Viking Age itself was changing. The external pressures and internal transformations would soon bring this epic era of expansion to a close. And that, my friends, is a story we'll delve into in our next chapter. Stay tuned, because the final acts of this incredible historical drama are just as compelling as its beginnings. The frost-bitten shores of Vinland, with its fleeting promise and ultimate retreat, represent a fascinating, if temporary, zenith of Norse exploration. But while some of the Norse were pushing the boundaries of the known world to the west, back in their homelands, a different kind of transformation was underway, one that would ultimately redefine their societies and bring the curtain down on the age of the, quote, 57, quote, as we've come to know it. We've journeyed through 2 centuries of unparalleled expansion, but now it's time to look at the forces that pulled these ambitious peoples back towards consolidation and integration. Think back to the fragmented, chieftain-led societies of late 8th century Scandinavia. We pictured independent jarls holding sway over their local domains, their power rooted in land, wealth, and the loyalty of their Karla. This decentralized structure in a way fueled the early Viking Age, as ambitious individuals or groups could easily gather followers and launch their own expeditions, seeking fortune and fame abroad. But this very success, the wealth flowing back into Scandinavia, and the increasing contact with centralized European kingdoms began to sow the seeds of change. The rise of kings, from chieftains to unified kingdoms. Across Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, the late 9th and 10th centuries saw a dramatic shift, the gradual, often bloody, consolidation of power into the hands of a few powerful kings. We've already touched upon Harald Fairhair, whose efforts to unite Norway under a single crown in the late 9th century were a direct catalyst for many seeking independence to settle Iceland and Greenland. But Harald's legacy was more than just an impetus for emigration. It was a blueprint for nascent state building. His successors continued the arduous process of asserting royal authority, often clashing with stubborn local jarls who valued their autonomy. In Denmark, the process was perhaps even more pronounced. By the 10th century, we see figures like Gorm the Old and his son Harold Bluetooth. Yes, that Bluetooth, whose name lives on in our modern technology, a testament to his unifying communication efforts. Emerge as powerful monarchs. Harold Bluetooth is particularly significant, not just for his military prowess in uniting the disparate Danish lands, but for his embrace of Christianity, which we'll delve into shortly. The Danish kings, with their strategic control over trade routes and proximity to the Frankish and Holy Roman Empires, were particularly adept at leveraging the wealth and experience gained from Viking expeditions to strengthen their own positions. Knut the Great, in the early 11th century, would even forge a vast North Sea empire, temporarily uniting England, Denmark, and Norway under his rule, a truly astonishing feat, showcasing the culmination of centuries of Norse ambition and political evolution. Sweden too saw its own process of unification, albeit a bit later and more fragmented due to its vast geography and diverse regional identities. The Svea in the north and the Gotar in the south gradually coalesced under single rulers, their focus often directed eastward across the Baltic, where the Rus had already laid foundations for future states. What does this mean for the Viking Age? It means that the independent, opportunistic raiding parties, while still existing, were increasingly brought under royal control. Kings began to see the strategic value of organized military campaigns, not just for plunder, but for conquest and the establishment of stable, taxable territories. The energy that once drove individual adventurers was now being channeled into the formation of powerful, centralized monarchies, capable of fielding larger armies and engaging in diplomacy on a grander scale. The cross triumphs, Christianization of Scandinavia. Perhaps the most profound internal transformation and a key factor in the eventual end of the Viking Age was the gradual yet inexorable Christianization of Scandinavia. For centuries we've seen the Norse as staunch pagans, their lives intertwined with the sagas of Odin, Thor and Freya, their worldview shaped by the pursuit of glory and the promise of Valhalla. This pagan ethos, with its emphasis on courage, fate, and the acquisition of wealth, certainly fueled much of the early raiding. But contact with Christian Europe, both through violent raids and peaceful trade, slowly but surely chipped away at the old ways. Imagine the paradox: Viking raiders plundering monasteries, yet encountering the very symbols and stories of the faith they were attacking. Traders returning with not just silver and silks, but also tales of a powerful universal God whose followers built magnificent cathedrals and organized vast empires. Missionaries, often accompanying traders, or even arriving under royal patronage, began to preach the new faith. Christianity offered distinct advantages to the emerging Scandinavian kings. Adopting Christianity wasn't just a spiritual choice, it was a political one. It allowed them to integrate more fully into the established political and diplomatic networks of Christian Europe. It provided a powerful ideological framework for centralized rule, with kings ruling by divine right rather than just by force of personality and lineage. It offered a sophisticated legal system, literacy and administrative structures that could help manage a growing kingdom. And yes, it helped legitimize their rule in the eyes of their Christian neighbors, making alliances and trade agreements easier to forge. The conversion process was rarely swift or clean. It often involved a period of syncretism where elements of paganism coexisted or blended with Christian practices. Sometimes it was a top-down affair, with kings converting first, then attempting to impose the new faith on their subjects, often with resistance. Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf II, Saint Olaf in Norway, both 10th and 11th century kings, are famous for their zealous, often brutal, efforts to Christianize their lands. Harold Bluetooth, as mentioned, famously proclaimed on the gelling stone that he made the Danes Christian. While this was likely an overstatement of the speed and completeness of conversion, it signals a deliberate royal policy. By the mid-11th century, while pockets of paganism certainly persisted, the Scandinavian kingdoms were largely officially Christian. Churches dotted the landscape. Bishops held sway, and the old gods began to recede into folklore. This shift fundamentally altered the Norse identity, redirecting their ambitions from pagan glory to Christian piety, and from external raiding to internal governance within a European context. The fading roar, factors leading to the end of the Viking Age. So, what ultimately brought an end to the Viking Age as we define it? The period of large-scale, often pagan-led, maritime expansion and raiding. It wasn't a single event, but a confluence of internal and external factors that gradually transformed the Norse from external disruptors into integrated, albeit powerful, European players. Internally, the consolidation of power in Scandinavia created stronger, more stable kingdoms. Kings now had less tolerance for independent raiding parties that might destabilize their relationships with other European monarchs. They sought to control the flow of wealth and manpower, directing it towards state-building and organized warfare rather than individual enterprise. The Christianization of these societies further eroded the pagan ethos that had glorified raiding and external conquest without religious qualm. The notion of, quote, 61, quote, would eventually emerge in Christian Europe. But it was a very different beast than the opportunistic, wealth-driven pagan raids. Externally, the kingdoms of Europe had learned to adapt. Coastal defences were strengthened, early warning systems improved, and standing armies became more common. The initial shock and vulnerability that made places like Lindisfarne easy targets were gone. Kings like Alfred the Great in England had shown that resistance was possible and effective. Furthermore, the economic landscape changed. The low-hanging fruit of easily plundered monasteries and undefended towns had largely been picked. The Danegeld, while initially lucrative, eventually became less sustainable as European kingdoms developed better fiscal systems and military responses. The quota 62 of accessible wealth diminished, and the quota 63 of acquiring it increased. The Norse themselves were also integrating. The settlements in England, the Danelaw, Ireland, Normandy, and the Rus lands were no longer just foreign outposts. They were becoming part of the local fabric, intermarrying, adopting local customs, and eventually converting to Christianity. The descendants of Vikings were now English lords, Irish chieftains, Norman dukes, and Rus princes, their loyalties shifting from their ancestral homelands to their new territories. A final stand, Harold Hardrada and Stamford Bridge, 1066 CE. If we have to pinpoint a symbolic end to the Viking Age, a moment when the old spirit made one last grand and ultimately futile stand, it would undoubtedly be the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066 CE. This wasn't just any battle. It was a clash of titans, involving figures whose lives encapsulate the very essence of the age. Enter Harald Sigurdsson, better known to history as Harald Hardrada, meaning hard ruler or stern counsel. What a life this man led. He was a Norwegian prince, exiled in his youth, who became a mercenary serving in Kievan Rus and rising to command the elite Varangian guard for the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople. He fought in North Africa, the Middle East, and the Byzantine Empire, accumulating immense wealth and military experience. He was truly a global adventurer, a living legend, embodying the far-reaching influence and martial prowess of the Norse. After years abroad, he returned to Norway to claim his throne, ruling as king from 1047 CE. In 1066 CE, following the death of England's King Edward the Confessor, a succession crisis erupted. Harold Godwinson, an English earl, was crowned king, but his claim was challenged by William, Duke of Normandy, a descendant of Rollo, and by Harald Hardrada. Hardrada, invited by Harold Godwinson's estranged brother Tostig Godwinson, saw an opportunity to revive the old North Sea Empire of Nut the Great. He assembled a massive invasion fleet, reportedly hundreds of longships, and a formidable army, including many of his seasoned veterans, sailing for England. This was a Viking invasion on a scale not seen for decades, a throwback to the glory days of the Great Heathen Army. They landed in northern England, achieving initial successes, including a victory at the Battle of Fulford. King Harold Godwinson, however, proved to be a remarkably swift and decisive leader. He force-marched his army over 185 miles, about 300 kilometres, from the south of England in just 4 days, catching Hardrada's forces completely by surprise near the village of Stamford Bridge. Imagine the scene. The Norse, largely unarmoured and resting after their recent victory, were caught off guard. Harald Hardrada, recognising the dire situation, fought with the legendary ferocity of a true Viking warrior, reportedly falling in the thick of battle. The fighting was brutal and prolonged, but Harold Godwinson's army, though exhausted, utterly decimated the Norse. Only a fraction of Hardrada's fleet was needed to carry the few survivors back to Norway. Stamford Bridge was a devastating defeat, marking the last major Viking invasion of England and, by extension, of Western Europe. It was the final grand gesture of an era passing into history. Just weeks later, Harold Godwinson himself would fall at the Battle of Hastings, defeated by William the Conqueror, whose Norman forces, themselves descendants of Norse settlers, ushered in a new chapter of English history. The wheel had turned. The disruptors of old were now the architects of new empires. The echoes remain. Legacy of the Viking Age. The Viking Age, from its explosive beginning at Lindisfarne to its dramatic end at Stamford Bridge, was a period of unbelievable dynamism and transformation. Far from being mere brutal barbarians, the Norse were complex, adaptable, and immensely influential. They were master shipwrights whose vessels allowed them to explore, trade, and conquer across 3 continents and the vast Atlantic. They were astute traders who forged global networks stretching from the Arctic to Baghdad, laying the foundations for cities like Dublin, Kiev, and Novgorod. They were innovative settlers who established democratic assemblies in Iceland and new duchies in Normandy. They were fierce warriors who forced Europe to fortify and adapt, inadvertently contributing to the rise of feudalism. Their impact echoes through history, in the English language peppered with Norse words, in the legal systems of the North Atlantic, in the genetic makeup of populations across Europe, and in the very names of places they settled. We see their spirit of exploration in the sagas and their ingenuity in the archaeological finds that continue to amaze us. The Viking Age didn't end because the Norse people vanished, but because they evolved. They became integral parts of the European tapestry, their pagan ferocity tempered by Christian faith, their independent spirit channeled into the building of powerful unified kingdoms. The longships eventually gave way to merchant vessels and warships of a different kind, and the raiders became kings, merchants, and farmers. The age of the Viking as a distinct disruptive force was over, but its legacy was and remains utterly indelible. Welcome back, history enthusiasts, to quote 67 quote. We've journeyed through the rise and zenith of the Viking Age, witnessed its incredible scope, and, in our last chapter, observed its symbolic conclusion with the dramatic clash at Stamford Bridge in 1066 CE. But here's the crucial point, a paradox we must address. An age might end, but the people, their culture, and their profound impact do not simply vanish. Far from it. The final, brutal defeat of Harald Hardrada's grand invasion didn't erase 1,000 years of Norse ingenuity and ambition. Instead, it marked a pivotal moment of transformation, where the energy and dynamism that defined the Viking Age were redirected, reshaped, and woven indelibly into the fabric of medieval Europe and beyond. Imagine, if you will, the ripples spreading out from a stone dropped into a vast ocean. The immediate splash is the raid on Lindisfarne. The subsequent waves are the great armies, the settlements, the trade networks, the explorations. But even after the stone has sunk, the ripples continue to travel, subtly altering the shoreline, shaping what comes next. That, my friends, is the lasting legacy of the Norse, an echo that resonates through our language, our laws, our very understanding of the world. Let's start with perhaps the most pervasive and often overlooked legacy. Language. If you're speaking English right now, you are, whether you realize it or not, speaking a language profoundly shaped by the Vikings. When the great heathen army established the Danelaw in England, they didn't just conquer territory, they initiated a massive linguistic exchange. Old English, the language of the Anglo-Saxons, encountered Old Norse, and the two began to intertwine in a fascinating linguistic dance. Think about it. Words like sky, window, leg, skin, take, give, they, them, there. These aren't originally Anglo-Saxon. They are direct Norse loanwords, absorbed into the English vernacular. Before the Vikings, the Anglo-Saxons used words like, quote, 77 for sky, quote, 78, eye hole for window, and quote, 79 for skin. The Norse brought a new vocabulary, often simpler, more direct, and it stuck. This wasn't just about individual words, it was about grammatical structures too. The flexibility and directness that characterizes modern English owes a significant debt to this Anglo-Norse linguistic fusion. Without the Vikings, English as we know it today would be a very different language, perhaps closer to modern German or Dutch. It's a truly mind-boggling thought, isn't it? Our everyday communication is a testament to those long-ago encounters. But the influence wasn't just lexical. The Norse also left their mark on law and governance. The very concept of local self-governance, of a community coming together to decide its own affairs, found fertile ground in the Danelaw. While the Anglo-Saxons had their own legal traditions, the Norse thing system, those assemblies of freemen where disputes were settled and laws were made, reinforced and sometimes directly influenced local administration. You see place names across England ending in dash by, like Derby, Whitby, or dash Thorpe, like Scunthorpe, clear indicators of Norse settlement and the communities they established. These communities often retained elements of Norse legal practice, contributing to the rich tapestry of common law that would eventually develop in England. The idea of a jury, for example, while having complex origins, found a strong parallel in Norse legal customs of calling upon local, reputable men to give evidence or judgment. The legacy here is one of decentralized power and community participation, a stark contrast to the more feudal top-down systems emerging elsewhere. And then, of course, we have the Normans. The Normans. This is where the story truly becomes cyclical, where the end of the Viking Age in 1066 CE at Stamford Bridge is immediately followed by another pivotal moment of Norse legacy just weeks later at the Battle of Hastings. William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy, was, in essence, a direct descendant of the Viking chieftain Rollo. The Normans were Vikings who had settled in Francia, adopted Christianity, learned French, and built a powerful, highly organized duchy. They had taken the raw, enterprising spirit of their Norse ancestors and married it with Frankish administrative prowess and military innovation. When William landed in England, he wasn't just a French duke. He was the inheritor of a Viking legacy of military efficiency, strategic thinking, and a ruthless ambition for land and power. The Norman conquest was, in a very real sense, the final Viking invasion of England, albeit one cloaked in continental armour and Christian piety. And what an impact they made! They replaced the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy with a new Anglo-Norman elite, fundamentally reshaping English society, law, and culture. French became the language of the court and law for centuries, blending further with the Anglo-Norse English to create the foundation of modern English. The Normans, those, quote, 83, didn't just conquer England, they transformed it into a dominant European power, a legacy that reverberated for centuries. But their ambition didn't stop at England's shores. The Norman drive, that same restless, enterprising spirit that propelled the longships across the North Sea, also led them south. Norman adventurers carved out kingdoms in southern Italy and Sicily, creating a vibrant, multicultural realm that blended Latin, Greek, Arabic, and Norse influences. They became formidable players in the Mediterranean, even participating in the Crusades, once again demonstrating that the Viking spirit of exploration, conquest, and adaptation could manifest in vastly different forms and across diverse landscapes. It's a powerful testament to the inherent adaptability of these people, isn't it? Meanwhile, back in Scandinavia, the homelands of the Vikings were undergoing their own profound transformation. The petty kingdoms and chieftaincies that had characterized the early Viking Age were consolidating into powerful, unified Christian monarchies. Kings like Harold Fairhair had started the process, but it was over centuries that Denmark, Norway, and Sweden emerged as distinct, centralized states, integrated into the wider European political and religious landscape. This wasn't an abandonment of their past, but a repurposing of it. The wealth accumulated through raiding and trade, the administrative experience gained from managing vast networks, and the maritime prowess honed over centuries of seafaring were now channeled into state building. Churches and cathedrals rose where pagan temples once stood, but the underlying structures of society, the strong tradition of local governance, the thing, and the fierce independence of the freemen often remained. Scandinavian kings became active participants in European politics, forging alliances, engaging in diplomacy, and even launching their own crusades in the Baltic region. The former raiders were now respected, and sometimes feared, members of the European Commonwealth of Nations. And it's in this period that we see the incredible preservation of Norse culture, particularly in Iceland. While the mainland Scandinavian kingdoms moved closer to the European mainstream, Iceland, settled largely by those seeking freedom from unifying kings, remained a bastion of Old Norse language and traditions. It was here, in the isolated farmsteads and around the communal hearths, that the sagas, those epic tales of gods, heroes, kings, and ordinary people, were meticulously composed and written down. The poetic Edda and the prose Edda, our primary sources for Norse mythology, were recorded by Icelandic scholars like Snorri Sturluson. These works aren't just fascinating stories, they are invaluable windows into the worldview, values, and history of the Viking Age, preserved by a people who consciously chose to remember their past even as the world around them changed. Imagine the dedication, the cultural pride needed to undertake such a monumental task. Without the Icelanders, much of what we know about Norse paganism and heroic tradition would be lost to time. And let's not forget the enduring legacy in Eastern Europe. The Rusgat, those primarily Swedish Norsemen who forged the riverine trade routes, laid the very foundations for what would become modern Russia and Ukraine. Cities like Novgorod and Kiev, established as Norse trading outposts, grew into powerful political and cultural centres. Prince Vladimir the Great's conversion to Orthodox Christianity in 988 CE was not merely a religious act. It was a geopolitical one, aligning Kievan Rus firmly with the Byzantine Empire and shaping the spiritual and cultural identity of a vast region for over a millennium. The impact of the Rus on the development of these nations, their early statehood and their connection to the wider world is simply incalculable. So, when we look back at the entire history of the Viking Age, we're not just looking at a period of raids and exploration. We're witnessing an unbelievable surge of human ambition, ingenuity, and adaptability that left an indelible mark on 3 continents. From the linguistic tapestry of English to the legal frameworks of local governance, from the foundational states of Scandinavia and Eastern Europe to the dynamic Norman empires of England and the Mediterranean, the Norse spirit permeated and transformed. They were not merely the quote 86 quote of popular imagination. They were master shipwrights who connected disparate worlds, canny traders who built vast commercial empires, skilled artisans whose craftsmanship still awes us, and intrepid explorers who reached North America centuries before Columbus. They were state builders, lawgivers, and storytellers. Their pagan worldview, once seen as a threat, gave way to Christianization, but the underlying drive for honor, glory, An enterprise persisted, simply finding new outlets and new forms. The Viking Age, then, is a testament to the fact that history is never static. It's a continuous flow, where old energies find new channels. The people of the North, once external disruptors, became integral architects of the emerging medieval world, their influence a constant, fascinating undercurrent. And as we conclude this journey, I hope you've gained a deeper appreciation for the sheer complexity, the incredible dynamism, and the utterly compelling story of a people who truly shaped the course of human events. It's a saga that continues to unfold, even in our modern world, if you just know where to look. Thank you for joining me on this incredible exploration. If you've enjoyed unraveling the myths and discovering the truths of this extraordinary era, please let me know. The Viking Age might have ended in 1066, but its echoes, my friends, they resonate forever. Welcome back to Dreamy History, where we're not just chronicling events, but truly unpacking the entire story of the Viking Age. We've journeyed from the rugged fjords of Scandinavia, across the tumultuous seas to the shores of England, Ireland, and even North America, and deep into the river systems that would become Russia. We've seen these incredible Norse people transition from opportunistic raiders to sophisticated traders, ambitious conquerors, and intrepid explorers. And now we arrive at the twilight of this extraordinary era. The year 1066 CE stands as a powerful symbolic bookend, marked by the dramatic defeat of Harald Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. You might remember Harald as that larger-than-life figure, the last great Viking king, a mercenary who had fought from the Byzantine Empire to the Russian steppes, a true embodiment of the old Norse warrior spirit. His death wasn't just the end of a single campaign, it was a resounding clang of the curtain closing on an age defined by external Viking invasions. But here's the thing. The ending of the Viking Age wasn't a sudden cataclysmic event. Far from it. It was a gradual, multifaceted transformation, driven by both internal shifts within Scandinavia and external adaptations across Europe. So let's peel back the layers and understand why this dynamic, expansionist era began to recede, and what enduring legacy it left behind. Think about it. For centuries, the Norse had been a diffuse collection of independent jarls, petty kings, and ambitious carlers, united by language and culture, but often competing amongst themselves. This decentralized structure was, paradoxically, a source of both strength and weakness. It allowed for incredible individual enterprise and flexibility, but it also meant that large-scale unified resistance against external threats or internal consolidation was difficult. As the 11th century dawned, this began to change dramatically. One of the most profound internal transformations was the consolidation of power into unified Christian monarchies across Scandinavia. Imagine the landscape that once saw dozens of jarls vying for influence, raiding each other's territories and leading their own independent expeditions. Over time, powerful families, often through a blend of strategic alliances, warfare, and sheer political acumen, began to assert dominance. In Denmark, kings like Harald Bluetooth and Nut the Great forged powerful, if sometimes transient, empires. In Norway, figures like Olaf II, later Saint Olaf, played a crucial role in centralizing authority. And in Sweden, the process, though perhaps slower, also led to the emergence of a unified kingdom. This wasn't just about stronger kings, it was inextricably linked to the Christianization of Scandinavia. For centuries, the Norse had adhered to their rich, vibrant pagan worldview, a religion of action, honour, and a cyclical understanding of the cosmos. Odin, Thor, Freya. These deities shaped their understanding of the world, their morality, and their ambitions. But as they interacted more and more with Christian Europe, whether through trade, raid, or settlement, Christianity began to seep in. Missionaries, often protected by emerging kings who saw the political advantages of aligning with the broader European Christian network, slowly but surely converted the populations. And yes, this was a massive shift. A Christian king could appeal to a wider network of European monarchs, gaining legitimacy and support. The Church provided administrative structures, literacy, and a unifying ideological framework that helped to solidify royal authority. No longer was a king's power solely dependent on his personal charisma, his lineage, or his ability to command the loyalty of his warriors. Now, it was also divinely sanctioned. This meant that the energies and resources that once fueled independent raiding expeditions were increasingly channeled into building churches, administering burgeoning kingdoms, and participating in the wider European political game. The focus shifted from external plunder to internal development and consolidation. Simultaneously, European kingdoms were adapting to the Norse threat. Remember the early days when wealthy monasteries and undefended coastal towns were ripe for the picking? Those days were largely over. Kings and local lords had learned hard lessons. They built fortifications, stone castles, walled towns that were much harder to breach than the wooden palisades of earlier times. They developed standing armies, or at least better organised feudal levies, capable of responding more effectively to Viking incursions. Naval defences improved, making it riskier for longships to simply sail up a river unopposed. The element of surprise, a crucial advantage for the early Vikings, became increasingly difficult to achieve. This meant that the returns on raiding began to diminish. Why risk a dangerous voyage, a bloody battle, and potential death, when the rewards were smaller and the resistance stronger? The risk-reward calculus was changing. Instead of plundering, the Norse, or rather the now Christian Scandinavians, found new avenues for wealth and influence through established trade routes, diplomatic relations, and even participation in European crusades. The era of the opportunistic, independent Viking warband was giving way to an era of organised, state-sponsored military and economic activity. Furthermore, the very success of Viking settlement contributed to the end of the Age of Vikings. Think about the Danelaw in England, or the Duchy of Normandy, or the Rus principalities in Eastern Europe. These weren't just temporary encampments, they were established societies. The Norse settlers, over generations, integrated with the local populations. They adopted local customs, intermarried, and, crucially, often converted to Christianity. The Normans, for instance, became so thoroughly French in language and culture that by the time William the Conqueror invaded England in 1066, they were hardly, quote, 87, quote, in the traditional sense. Even though their lineage was undeniably Norse, they were a powerful feudal state, a product of Viking dynamism blended with Frankish organisation. This process of integration meant that the Gersisgersens, quote, 88, as an external marauding force gradually ceased to exist. They became the foundations of new nations and cultures. The energy that once drove them outward as raiders and explorers was now channeled inward into building and defending the states they had helped to create. But if the Viking Age as an era of external expansion came to an end, what about its enduring legacy? Oh, my friends, this is where the story truly becomes profound. Far from being a footnote in history, the impact of the Norse was nothing short of transformative, shaping the very fabric of Europe and beyond. Let's start with language. If you speak English, you are speaking a language profoundly shaped by the Vikings. Think about words like sky, window, husband, knife, call, take, give, low, happy, ill, ugly, weak, root, sister, brother. These aren't Latin or French. They're old Norse loanwords, absorbed into the English language during the centuries of Norse settlement in England. The grammatical structure of English was also influenced, simplifying some of its Old English complexities. It's a testament to the deep, everyday interaction between these cultures. Then there's the legal systems. The Norse had a sophisticated system of law, governance and dispute resolution, centered around the Thing assemblies. While not directly transplanted in its entirety, the concept of local assemblies, of laws being publicly proclaimed and agreed upon, and of individual rights and responsibilities, resonated with developing legal traditions across Europe. The Normans, in particular, carried elements of their Norse-derived administrative and legal structures into England after 1066, contributing to the development of common law. The formation of new states is perhaps one of the most tangible legacies. Without the Norse, there would be no modern Scandinavia as we know it, with its unified kingdoms. There would be no Russia and Ukraine, whose very names derive from the Rus Norsemen who founded their earliest urban centres and trade networks. And of course, there would be no England as we understand it, not just because of the linguistic and legal influences, but because the Norman conquest of 1066, led by a descendant of a Viking chieftain, fundamentally reshaped its monarchy, aristocracy, and culture, creating the Anglo-Norman synthesis that defines medieval England. Beyond these political and linguistic impacts, we have the incredible preservation of their rich mythology and history through the Icelandic sagas. Isolated on their island, the Icelandic Norse, descendants of those who fled the consolidating monarchies of Norway, meticulously recorded their history, their genealogies, their epic poems, and their myths. The poetic Edda and the prose Edda are our primary sources for understanding the Norse gods: Odin, Thor, Freya, Loki, and their complex cosmology. The sagas, like Egil's saga or Njal's saga, offer unparalleled insights into their daily lives, their honour code, their feuds, and their incredible voyages. These aren't just stories, they are windows into the soul of a people. And let's not forget the sheer magnitude of their raw exploration and trade. The Norse were the original globalizers of the early Middle Ages. Their trade network stretched from the Arctic Circle, bringing furs and walrus ivory, to the markets of Constantinople and Baghdad, exchanging silver and silks. They established permanent settlements across the North Atlantic, pushing the boundaries of human habitation. The discovery of Vinland centuries before Columbus is a stark reminder of their unparalleled maritime prowess and adventurous spirit. This wasn't just about raiding, it was about connecting disparate parts of the world, fostering cultural exchange and expanding the known human horizon. Ultimately, the quote 90 that complex, adaptable, and endlessly fascinating people, were far more than the brutal barbarians of popular imagination. They were master shipwrights, creating vessels that were the envy of their age. They were skilled artisans, leaving behind stunning metalwork and carvings. They were canny traders, establishing vibrant commercial hubs. They were farmers, adapting to harsh landscapes. They were poets, preserving epic tales. And yes, they were fierce warriors, but their warfare was often a means to an end. Land, wealth, glory, and a place in a rapidly changing world. The Viking Age ended not with a whimper, but with a transformation. The energy that had driven them across oceans and continents was redirected, internalized, and harnessed to build the very nations that would define medieval and modern Europe. Their legacy is etched into our languages, our laws, our maps, and our imaginations. They were truly pioneers, leaving an indelible mark on the tapestry of human history. And with that, we conclude our journey through the entire history of the Viking Age. What an unbelievable surge of human ambition, ingenuity, and resilience we've witnessed together. If you've enjoyed this deep dive, I encourage you to keep exploring, because history, my friends, is always more complex, more surprising, and more utterly compelling than you could ever imagine. Thank you for joining me. Welcome back to Dreamy History. We've journeyed across vast oceans, explored new lands, and witnessed the incredible ambition of the Norse. We've seen them settle Iceland, brave the icy waters to Greenland, and even touch the shores of North America, leaving behind the tantalizing archaeological evidence at Lonso Meadows and the rich tapestry of the Icelandic sagas. But just as all great sagas must have their conclusion, so too did the Viking Age, and what a complex, multifaceted conclusion it was. The year 1066 CE, a date forever etched in English history, often serves as the symbolic bookend to this dynamic era. While the Norman conquest, a story we've touched upon, is the more famous event of that year, it was just weeks earlier, at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, that the last great Viking king, Harald Hardrada of Norway, met his end. Imagine, if you will, the clash of shields, the cries of battle, as Hardrada, often called the last Viking, fell to the forces of King Harold Godwinson. It was a dramatic, bloody farewell to an era, a final, audacious bid for English soil. But here's the crucial insight. The Viking Age didn't simply stop with a single battle. Far from it. No, the end of the Viking Age was a far more nuanced process, driven by profound internal shifts within Scandinavia itself, coupled with significant external pressures and adaptations across Europe. Remember those fiercely independent jarls, those powerful chieftains we discussed early on, who commanded loyalty and led expeditions? Well, over time, their power began to be challenged and absorbed by ambitious kings seeking to consolidate their realms. In Norway, Harald Fairhair had laid the groundwork for a unified kingdom, but it was a continuous struggle for his successors to truly cement that authority. In Denmark, figures like Gorm the Old and his son Harald Bluetooth forged a more unified kingdom, asserting control over disparate territories. And in Sweden, Olof Skötkonung became the first king to mint coins and truly exert centralized authority, moving away from the more localized power structures. And what was the most powerful engine for this consolidation? Without a doubt, it was the gradual, yet inexorable embrace of Christianity. For centuries, the Norse had clung to their vibrant, action-oriented pagan beliefs, to Odin and Thor and Freya, finding meaning in courage, honour, and the promise of Valhalla. But as we've seen with the Rus in Kievan Rus, Christianity offered something profoundly powerful to these emerging kings: political legitimacy and administrative infrastructure. It wasn't just about converting souls, it was about connecting to the established power structures of Christian Europe. A Christian king could claim divine right, gain alliances with powerful emperors and popes, and crucially establish a more organised, literate administration through the church. Bishops and scribes brought written laws, centralised record-keeping, and a new framework for governance that the decentralised, oral tradition-based pagan system simply couldn't match. Imagine the longhouses of old, with their local assemblies, the things, where disputes were settled and laws recited from memory. Now picture new stone churches rising, often built on the very sites of pagan temples, becoming centres of power and learning, symbols of a new order. This wasn't always a peaceful transition, mind you. There were fierce struggles between the old ways and the new, often marked by violence and deep cultural resistance. But ultimately, the promise of stability, the potential for greater wealth through integration into Christian trade networks, and the allure of belonging to the larger European political sphere proved too strong to resist. The Scandinavian kingdoms slowly but surely became Christian monarchies, looking more and more like their continental neighbours. Meanwhile, across Europe, the very lands that had once been so vulnerable to Viking raids were learning to adapt. Coastal defences improved dramatically. Fortifications grew stronger, with stone castles replacing wooden palisades. Kings and emperors began to organise more effective standing armies and navies, capable of meeting Viking forces in open battle or intercepting their ships. The element of surprise, the sheer terror of the longship appearing out of the mist, began to wane. The easy pickings, the undefended monasteries and wealthy towns were simply no longer there. Europe was hardening its defences, making the traditional hit-and-run tactics of earlier Viking raids less profitable and far more dangerous. And let's not forget the profound integration of the Norse settlers themselves. In the Danelaw, those great armies that had once terrorised England had put down roots, married into local populations, and slowly but surely became Anglo-Saxons, albeit Anglo-Saxons with a distinct Norse flavour. In Normandy, the descendants of Rollo, fierce Norsemen once, were now French-speaking dukes, builders of formidable castles and grand cathedrals, poised to become one of the most powerful forces in medieval Europe, eventually conquering England itself. And in the east, the Rus had become thoroughly Slavicized, their Viking origins fading into the rich tapestry of what would become Russia and Ukraine. The lines blurred. The distinct Viking identity, once so defined by its outward expansion, began to dissolve into the new societies it had helped create, leaving behind an indelible cultural imprint. But to say the Viking Age simply ended is to miss its profound, enduring legacy. For us, here in the modern English-speaking world, its impact is literally in the words we use every day. Think about it. Words like sky, window, husband, anger, take, give, leg, root, skin, skull, they, them, there. These aren't Anglo-Saxon in origin. They're Old Norse loanwords, absorbed into English during the Danelaw period, as Norse and Anglo-Saxon speakers lived side by side, influencing each other's language. The very structure of our language, the way we express ourselves, carries the echoes of those Viking settlers. Even place names across England. Anything ending in dash by, like Grimsby or Derby, dash Thorpe, like Scunthorpe, or dash Toft, are direct linguistic markers of Norse settlement. It's truly fascinating, isn't it? How a language can be a living archaeological site, preserving whispers of the past. Beyond language, the Viking Age laid the groundwork for entire nations. Modern Denmark, Norway, and Sweden emerged from the consolidation of those Viking kingdoms, their national identities forged in this period of expansion and transformation. Kievan Rus, forged by Norse traders and warriors, became the cradle of Russia and Ukraine, establishing crucial trade routes and political structures that endured for centuries. And in England, while the Normans were French-speaking, their ultimate conquest of England in 1066 was a direct consequence of that initial Norse settlement in Normandy. The Anglo-Norman state that followed, with its blend of Anglo-Saxon, Norse and French influences, shaped English law and governance for centuries to come. And let's not forget Iceland, that remote island where the Althing, the world's oldest continuous parliament, still stands as a testament to Norse legal innovation and self-governance. The concept of the Thing, those local assemblies, influenced early democratic ideas and traditions of legal recourse. But perhaps one of the most invaluable legacies for us historians and enthusiasts are the Icelandic sagas. Written centuries after the events they describe, often in the 13th and 14th centuries, these epic tales like Egil's saga, Njal's saga, or the saga of Erik the Red, are more than just stories. They are vibrant, often brutal, but always compelling windows into the Norse worldview. Their values, their complex family feuds, their intricate legal disputes, their incredible voyages and their rich mythology. They preserved a culture that might otherwise have been lost to time, offering us vivid first-hand, or at least first culture, insights into the lives, ambitions and spiritual beliefs of these people. Without them, our understanding of the Viking Age would be immeasurably poorer, and the voices of these remarkable individuals would be largely silent. So as we draw our journey through the Viking Age to a close, it's vital to reflect on how our perception of these people has evolved. We started by challenging the simplistic stereotype of the horned helmeted barbarian, the mindless raider, a caricature that has long obscured the truth. And I hope through our exploration you've come to see a far richer, more complex truth. The Norse were indeed fierce warriors, yes, but they were so much more. They were master shipwrights, whose longships were technological marvels, capable of navigating both open ocean and shallow rivers, making global exploration possible. They were canny traders, establishing vast networks from the Arctic to Baghdad, connecting disparate cultures and economies, bringing wealth and exotic goods back to Scandinavia. They were skilled artisans, creating breathtaking jewelry, intricate carvings, and sophisticated metalwork that showcased their unique aesthetic. They were fun, innovative farmers, adapting to challenging northern lands and building self-sufficient communities. They were fearless explorers, pushing the boundaries of the known world, reaching North America centuries before Columbus. They were state builders, forging kingdoms and laying the foundations of future nations across Scandinavia, Eastern Europe, and beyond. and they were deeply spiritual, guided by a rich mythology that infused every aspect of their lives, from daily tasks to grand voyages. The Viking Age was an unbelievable surge of human ambition, resilience, and adaptability. It was an era of profound transformation, not just for Scandinavia, but for all of Europe and beyond. It was a period when a relatively small group of people from a challenging northern landscape left an indelible, undeniable mark on the course of global history. Their legacy isn't just in the ruins of their longhouses or the gold in their graves, but in the words we speak, the laws we inherited, and the very map of Europe. The story of the Vikings is a testament to human ingenuity, ambition, and the enduring power of exploration and cultural exchange. It's a story that continues to captivate us, challenging us to look beyond simple labels and embrace the complexity of our shared past. And that, my friends, is the true magic of history.